Good afternoon. I'm sorry you didn't get much of a break between sessions, but this is session 3 titled Paleontology, People and Archives. And my name is Karen Brewster, and I am with the UAF Oral History Program / Project Jukebox. And I am just moderating the session here and introducing folks. And our fourth presenter, David Norton, may or may not be joining us at the end. So we're short on time with 4 presentations. We'll do the best we can, but we might go a little late over, or we might run out of time for questions and answers, and then you can approach the speakers directly during the break. So I'm just going to get us started with our first speaker, who is Paul Goodfellow. And his paper is titled Salvaging and Building an Archive. And Paul is a program manager with the Alaska Division of Geological and Geophysical Surveys in Anchorage. He has a master's in public administration from George Mason University and a Bachelor of Arts in History and Political Science from Evergreen State College.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. So I probably have the least interesting presentation out of all of these, so it's okay if you want to fall asleep. So just a show of hands before I start in, how many of you have worked with federal archives in the past on research papers, projects, theses, dissertations? Okay, a good chunk of you. So this may be of interest to you. If I can get it to go forward. So I have come up with a very uncreative title, Salvaging and Building an Archive. This is a project between the Alaska Division of Geological and Geophysical Surveys. We're being supported by the U.S. Geologic Survey and the U.S. Bureau of Land Management. And U.S. BLM is actually who gave this collection to us. So started off, this is a picture of the archive that BLM deposited at the Geologic Materials Center last year. So for those of you who have any familiarity with how US BLM works, they have a very large storage facility there at Campbell Creek. It's the Campbell Creek Warehouse. It's been around for about 30 plus years. And if you're also aware, they are running out of space. And early last year, they started going through their old paperwork collection, and they gave us a phone call and said, hey, you know, we have about 30 pallets worth of paperwork that we're just going to kind of give to you. And one day in early April, they showed up with about 15 of them and left them at our doorstep. And we started going through them. We've had a very good relationship and a very mutually beneficial relationship with BLM for a number of years. They've supported a lot of BLM's DGGS's mapping projects. They've worked with us on a lot of our critical minerals programming and oil and gas programs throughout the years. And so we didn't really think anything of it. And we started going through this paperwork collection. And I called over to the person who I've been working with. His name is Rob Brumbaugh. He's the head of the oil and gas division. And I just kind of asked him very bluntly, what exactly did you give us? And he goes, oh, well, it's a collection of paperwork on coal and oil and gas going back to the territorial years. And you guys will figure it out. We only opened up a couple boxes. So I started going through pallets, and I found this magnificent collection of paperwork on oil and gas and on the state's sort of economic resource development going back to the territorial period. So we've got stuff going clear back to the early 1900s, all the way up through about the late 2000s. The latest record we found is from 2009, and that's a set of DLT, digital sort of long storage tapes, all the way back to very old coal archives. So when we started really digging into it, we figured out this was a large portion of BLM's internally held NPRA and ANWR and Cook Inlet records. So this is kind of a very large survey of the work that BLM, the Department of the Interior, and some of the other federal agencies have been doing in the North Slope and in Cook Inlet going back for the last 120, 130 years. So one of the most interesting things that we've found in here is that we actually have most of the bureaucratic paperwork and the emails and memos that were filed during the EIS investigation for the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge between 1981 and 1987. So when we started digging through this, I kind of figured out there's a lot more to this than just simply a very large selection of what were 2D seismic surveys they told us initially. when I asked Rob, he said, "Oh, we have a lot of 2D seismic surveys, which, for geologists, this is basically just throwing a stick of dynamite down a hole and you have a megaphone on top of it and you listen, and that helps you sort of estimate oil and gas deposits." Well, we have that. We have a lot of that, but we also have all of these bureaucratic papers. And so last year I sat down with our curator, his name is Kurt Johnson, and I said, "Look, listen, Kurt, he has a lot of other paperwork," and I said, "We want to build an archival program here, and we're going to use this as our test case." So we decided to put in for money through the USGS, and we were able to get funding for it. And I'm actually going to talk about the archive, but I want to first give you guys an idea of what our funding situation looks like. So last year we put in for a grant through this very large mouthful of a grant called the National Geological and Geophysical Data Preservation Project. This is kind of USGS's their highlight archival program. They've been funding this for a number of years, going back to 2004. DGGS has been the recipient of this going back to about 2011. So we have a good track record of getting funding for this. And we put in for it, and we initially pitched the NPRA and Cook Inlet collection and said, we'll digitize this, and we'll see if we can't get information off of this. So USGS gave us $120,000, and Rob and BLM, feeling so bad for just depositing this on our shoulders, said, "Fine, we'll give you $75,000 to digitize this, and then we never have to look at this paperwork again." So between the two of them, we actually got almost $200,000, which for this collection, which I'll start showing you what's in here, it seems like a lot, but it's going to go pretty quickly. So we have paperwork, and then for those of you who remember the bad old days of computers in the 1980s, you probably remember the rest of this. At the very bottom right, those are what are known as 9-track mainframe tapes. Those are the really old reel-to-reels that used to run through computer mainframes. We have over 1,000 of these things that we are currently trying to transfer, along with all of the rest of this material. I just got a message this morning from my intern that she finally finished transferring all of the really old 5¼ inch floppy disks, which took weeks and weeks and weeks. So along with paper records, we have all of this. So in very short order, when we started investigating, we went from a paper archive to a multimedia archive, and then all of the associated problems with how do you transfer data from this stuff? How do you preserve the program interfaces? How do you preserve the outputs? And then on top of that, because we found out we had ANWR data, what do we do with this? Can we release it? Do we have, do we have to withhold this information from release? So we had to sit down with our legal teams. We had to discuss, are we allowed to release this? Some of it can, some of it can't. So we have all of this, and at the very bottom, we have 4 outdated computers, now 5 that we've had to purchase to actually get these tapes and floppies to output data in a format that we can read right now in 2025. So one of the challenges of this is that when these computer files were developed in the early mid-1980s, nobody was expecting somebody to come back 45 years later and have to start transferring this. There are no standard mechanisms for how to actually transfer data and preserve programmatic interface. It just doesn't exist. So for right now, what we've had to do is, my IT specialist, he sat down, we're going through abandonware files, open source software, we're picking up old pieces of computer equipment, we're scouring hobbyist boards, we're having conversations with people who actually still use these things. For some reason, there is a community of people who actually use old floppy disks and 9-track tapes for fun on weekends. And my first question was, why? Good God, why? But they do it. And so we're going to every corner of the internet that we can find to understand how to transfer this information. So it's in no single place. But the goal is pretty simple. We're going to digitize all of this. We want to make this all into a digitized format, and we want to make it all available for the public to start utilizing, because this is a really interesting and unique resource that we haven't really seen anywhere else. So these BLM archives, these field studies, these oil and gas research programs that BLM ran in the 70s and 80s and 90s, a lot of the records, they do exist, but they're not readily available. They're still in paper format, or they're still in sort of older computer files. So it's hard to get access to it. A lot of the oil and gas firms have been reticent to release it, or if they do, they'll say, if you want access, just come to our corporate archives and you can go ahead and go through these old dusty boxes. So we're trying something new here. We do have money to actually go out and hire an archivist and a part-time warehouse intern. So those of you who know people graduating with a master's in library sciences or archival studies, this project is going to be available probably in December, January for hire. We're going to put out for an archivist and actually try to bring somebody in to build us a actual functioning archive with this. And we've got this. We have our other major asset is our DGGS IT department. So as we've been going through this, we've started transferring a couple of tapes. My IT guys started work in the mid-1990s in Anchorage, used systems like this. So when I started showing him the tapes, he goes, yes, I know how to make these work. So, it's nice to actually have somebody who's familiar with these. The very top picture there, those are older data streamer cassettes, which I had to scour, and I found one single company located in Southern Oregon that still had one drive, a single drive sitting in the back of their warehouse, and I had to call them frantically and say, please, please give this to me. And I haggled them down to a whole $30 plus $10 shipping and handling. So we have everything we need. I am going to have to send that lone VHS down to the state archives. So if anybody works at the state archives office, you'll be receiving this soon for digitization. Enjoy. So we've only had this for a year, and I've only had funding to start digging through this for the last 2 months, but we've actually found quite a lot of information in here. So along with all of the other oil and gas survey data and coal survey data from the turn of the century, we also found out that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration had used Campbell Creek as a storage facility for a number of years. They left, but when they left, they also forgot to bring along a couple of the boxes of bottom trawl survey from the Gulf of Alaska in the mid-1970s. So they published their final paper, but they didn't release a lot of the very initial survey data. So we have a lot of their old survey data and 9-track tapes. I'm trying to find a NOAA contact who'd be interested in this. We figured this might be of interest to some of the fisheries scientists who are interested in looking at the impact of climate change on migratory species in the Gulf, and we figured maybe this could, help backfill some data. We also found a tape with what's known as ANWR photogravity data from 1984. So this is an early form of, I think it was like orbital data that they were using to try to estimate oil and gas backfill in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. The last one we also found endangered whale survey data from NOAA's North Pacific Survey based at the Scripps Institute, which I have no clue how data from the Scripps Institute ended up at Campbell Creek, but there we are, we have it. So all of this is stuff that we've found just in the last month and a half. So there's a lot of really interesting scientific data that we are trying to digitize and put in a format that scientists can use. This is where it's of interest to those of you who are energy historians or environmental historians. So along with this, when we started digging into a large portion of the paperwork, there was this sort of larger collection of work that was related to the Naval Petroleum Reserve, dating back to the 1940s. So when we were digging through this, we found a number of memos between Senator Ernest Gruning's office and the Pentagon's Office of the Oil and Shale Reserves in the early mid-1960s, right at the onset of the conversations about selling oil and gas leases in the NPRA. We found conversations between Pentagon planners where they were actually disputing the, privatizing the reserve. The large discussion was about, I believe it was defense interests. They had a conversation about energy shortages on the West Coast during the Second World War and the desire to maintain control over the Naval Petroleum Reserve in the event of a conflict with the Soviet Union. So they had these very interesting conversations. I also found a travel paperwork from Pentagon rep to attend UAF's, I think it was the Petroleum Environment and People Conference in August 1969. So I not only have his travel paperwork, I have a little packing slip that the Pentagon gave him that said, this is your baggage allowance for the Orient Pacific flight from Dulles to Fairbanks. So we have his packing slip, we have his itinerary. I also have his per diem rates, which is kind of interesting to know how much money. I think it was like $7 or $8 for breakfast a day or something like that. So we've got his per diem rates. And then the last thing is we have this incredibly large archive of bureaucratic paperwork from USGS and BLM on their ANWR findings. And this is from about 1981 until about 1987 when the EIS was published. And then the following year, USGS put out what's called their open file report, which was their geologic survey of ANWR discussing their oil and gas findings. And that's been kind of the most interesting part of that for us, has been understanding, for me at least, as somebody who sort of trained in history and political science, how the bureaucrats at the time viewed these deposits. And there actually was a pretty robust conversation. And by robust, I mean very angry. I found some very angry emails between field geologists based here, both in Anchorage and Fairbanks, and Washington, D.C. offices about how to start estimating ANWR's oil reserves. At one point, the term political flunkies was thrown around in a couple of these printed emails. And I found one email that a geologist sent, and it's been printed in 4 separate files. And I kept thinking, why is this printed out when this guy is calling everybody political flunkies and accusing them of using political favoritism to estimate oil reserves? So if you work with geologists, you know these are pretty, I call them chill people. They don't generally get into office disputes. They're the type of people who don't like to argue about their science, but there was some pretty robust disputes over this and disagreements. So it was interesting to see how the disputes manifested, specifically over how you estimate what's called oil trap fill. And I had to go sit down with a geologist and say, tell me what this is so I understand why it's important. And it's effectively like how you estimate the amount of oil in a specific deposit. And since they only had one oil well that they drilled, which was the Kaktovik Inupiat Corp well outside Kaktovik, they only had one set of data. But the problem is, for a lot of these field geologists, they couldn't read the data, so they were only given some of the very initial findings. And so they had to generate statistical results based on that one set of findings. And for a lot of these guys, and there were a lot of men primarily, they really didn't like that. A lot of these older Alaska field geologists liked being able to go out and do surveys of the oil and gas wells, and they would say, I want to go out and actually look at these things. I don't want you to give me a statistical analysis. I want the data myself to really run it and understand it. So it was interesting to understand both that sort of anger over it, and there was also distrust. At one point in some of the red line edits, there was some real disagreements about the use of computer modeling. So they not only distrusted the statistical modeling, they distrusted the use of computers to estimate these in general. They still really relied on their own field observations. So it was interesting to look at that and to see this sort of transition from this kind of old style of geology and field surveys over to more computerized data gathering. So we've learned a couple of lessons from this effort. First and foremost, there is very little paperwork to associate the collections with their provenance. So when this was given to us, we know it was transferred between different internal departments at BLM and USGS. I have no idea which departments it went to and what stuff may have been included and excluded. So we're not really sure how this collection came to be, other than that it all ended up at Campbell Creek at some point in the last 30 years, and now we haven't. We're trying to digitize it. We know that there is old computer data that is missing from this. We have a couple of sets of 3-ring binders with 9-track tape databases showing these are the tapes generated, these are the dates, these are where they're from. And we know that they're not there because we've gone through and we've done very initial sort of analyses of our tape holdings. So we know that the tapes aren't there. They've got to be somewhere. I've reached out to US Geologic Survey to see if they're there. We have no idea. There's been some discussion about they might have ended up down at Menlo Park, California, but the Menlo Park storage facility is now closed. So now I have no idea where those might have ended up. The second sort of lesson is that digitization is a far longer and more involved process than we'd expected. I went into this thinking, I'm just going to feed computer floppies into the computer. I'm going to take the files off. I can throw it up online. No problem. That's not the case at all. Having to interpret these older floppies is a very time-consuming process. Most of the older software just doesn't exist anymore. Or if it does, it's not in a format that I can actually read. So we have to go back. We have to start working with the IT department to try to do emulation of this old software and try to reproduce outputs, which is incredibly challenging. The third thing that we've come across, and it's something that those of you who work with federal archives should know, National Archives will no longer accept physical donations. And effectively, no federal agency I've talked to has the funds to digitize their on-site holdings. These are all sitting in storage warehouses, in courtroom basements, and they have no money to digitize these. And National Archives was given a mandate in 2020 to only accept digitized holdings from now on. So when I've contacted these agencies and said, hey, can you tell me if this stuff is living online? By and large, they'll say, absolutely not. They're sitting in our basement. We have no money to digitize these. And we can't send these to NARA Region 10 in Seattle because they won't take our donations any longer. So one of the things that we've started doing is DGGS, we've started engaging some of our federal partners to say, what do you guys have on site that you have no money to digitize and that you want to give to us? And we will take it and we will start digitizing it ourselves, because our big concern at this point is that this won't just be scientific research. This could be any number of archives that, probably all of you might have some interest in, could just be sitting, down in a district courthouse. And in 10 or 15 years, they could just say, this is excess holdings and just throw it into a trash pit. The reason that this stuff sat at Campbell Creek, funny enough, I don't suppose anybody here knows what that record group number is associated with in the National Archives system. Take a guess. Perfect. So then you probably saw these at some point. Record group 146.
I think that yellow piece of paper is misleading because I don't recall a record group 146. Something else.
It is. It's associated with the U.S. Civil Service Commission. Nope. I had to look that up. So when I sent that to my contact at BLM, he goes, oh, well, when we boxed those, we had somebody go through and check the NARA system and they assigned record group numbers. And I said, why did you assign it to the Civil Service Commission? And he goes, I don't know. Whoever was doing it did that. The Civil Service Commission closed in 1979 and folded in with the Office of Personnel Management. So we figure probably what happened was some poor intern in the mid-2000s was going through and had to collect these, and they probably ended up just misreading the record group number and wrote it on this little, yellow sticky note and stuck it there. And then probably at some point when the National Archives transferred down, I'm sure probably somebody either overlooked these or maybe they just miscategorized them, and there they sat for 20 odd years. So as we are digitizing this, one of the things we're doing is we're having conversations with NARA in Seattle, and we want to promote this archives use, and we want to make sure that we take some of the weight off of NARA, because it is an overburdened agency with not a lot of funding right now, and there's threats to federal funding, cuts to grants. So our goal right now is to try to make this into kind of an example for other state agencies to step into the breach and try to help conduct this digitization effort and preserve records like this. And we actually have money, so we can actually meet some of our milestones. Right now, my archivist is currently sitting with the Office of Management and Budget within DNR. I'm hoping to hire this person by December. Really hoping. Our other DNR person here can probably attest to the challenges of the state hiring system right now. So we're hoping to hire them. We'd like to get an intern pushed through. I have to get a hiring waiver for an intern, which is incredibly frustrating, but we're going to get through it. We're going to get our warehouse archival intern who's going to support pulling records off of the shelves, giving them to our archivist, and also supporting the digitization effort. I'd like to get them by spring 2026. BLM, because of the current federal fiscal situation, is kind of in limbo land right now. We're waiting on a transfer. When I spoke to them 2 weeks ago, they said, yeah, all of our federal funding's been yanked, so you've got to wait until after the first of the fiscal year in October. I'm really hoping to get money. Our completion of our 9-track tape transfers, I've actually been doing it myself. I've sat back in this little storage room back here and I've been digitizing them one at a time. I've been able to do sometimes upwards of 20 a day when I can get into the swing of it. So I figured if we can do 20 a day, we can get these things done in 3 months, and we can potentially fully digitize the computer archive portion of this within 4 to 5 months. So we'd like to continue doing this. Our archivist, we have enough money for about a full year and then a little more. So we're going to keep this person on. They're going to start digitizing other records. But for right now, this is what our back storage room looks like. Those are rolling tables that are supposed to be used for geologic samples. They are now loaded up with 9-track tapes. Every box on that rolling table you see in front of you is laden with 9-track tapes, between 9 and 15 of them packed into these boxes. So we have a Herculean task in front of us. The boxes off to the side on the left, a bunch of them are filled with 9-track tapes. We also have paper records in there. We have old maps. This is one of the largest collections that we have ever received at the GMC, and digitizing it's going to be a real lift, but we're looking forward to being able to digitize this and make it available to scientists, researchers, and historians like yourself. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, it's my job to interrupt you. I have my little alarm, but you didn't hear it, I guess. So moving on, our next presentation is called Building Anchorage's Landmark Database. And our presenters are Deirdre Bryan, who is a vice chair of the Anchorage Historic Preservation Commission and is a historian with the Alaska Department of Natural Resources, and is an adjunct professor at UAA. And also the co-author, presenter, I don't know how you guys are splitting this up, is Tom Davis. And he's a senior planner with the Municipality of Anchorage Planning Department. And he also is the municipality's historic preservation officer. So Deirdre and Tom, however you guys want to do this.
Hi, I'm Tom Davis with the Municipal Planning Department in Anchorage, Alaska here, and I am here to discuss some of the background behind our newest database in historic preservation Anchorage. Anchorage is one of 14 certified local governments associated with the Office of History and Archaeology, the state of Alaska, so we get grants from the National Park Service for historic preservation. And those parties encouraged Anchorage to develop this database as part of our certified local government program. Here with Dr. Deirdre Bryan. She's the vice chair of the Historic Preservation Commission, and we like to start our commission meetings in Anchorage about once a month, and we start them out with a land acknowledgement. And one of the important things about that for us is it helps us, grounds us regarding some of our most important historic and cultural resources in Anchorage. And just really quickly, some of the background about what those resources are. What we'd like to do is at the end of the presentation, we have some contacts, and as we give you an update about the development of our database, we're actually also looking for feedback from you, for some questions for you. So we're still developing it, and I think a lot of folks here would have some great input about it. But just a little bit of background, our historic resources in Anchorage are more than just buildings. They're natural landscapes, cultural sites, archaeological sites. They are traditional trail networks. There are also large groups of buildings, including the Lake Hood floatplane base, and some sites that are about conveying and training, educating the next generation in our living cultural traditions, the Alaska Native Heritage Center. Sorry? Yes, it is our first local landmark, and we have a local landmark register in Anchorage. We adopted it. The Anchorage Assembly adopted it in 2021, and up until this past spring, it sat empty. We had the ordinance, we had a register, but the Alaska Native Heritage Center came forward and recommended or nominated itself to be Anchorage's first local landmark. And the building itself is only 30 years old, but what the culture that's being forwarded there is thousands of years old. So they met our age criteria. Our local landmark register is a minimum of 30-year age for historic sites. So it's a little bit shorter than the National Register, but most of the other eligibility criteria, historic significance, the building's intact or the site's intact, those are very similar. Our historic inventory database is about those sites, and it's about the ones listed in our local landmark register, National Register, and also the sites that we're still determining whether they would be eligible or not. And there are several thousand that we know of in the municipality of Anchorage. And this database that we're developing has an internal side and the public-facing side. And the internal side is for us to be able to, with the municipal staff and the Historic Preservation Commissioner, to commission researchers to be able to see all of Anchorage's historic and cultural sites there in the database and also in a visual map. And that is for several purposes, one of which is, as a certified local government, Anchorage must be consulted by the DOT, Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, the Anchorage International Airport, and other agencies, and even private developers whose projects have federal money. And federal money means that they must determine whether they are having impacts to a historic site. If they are, then they must mitigate. Mitigation means funding and resources for preservation in Anchorage. We also use the map to look for geographic trends in where we have sites and where we may identify areas where we can develop districts. On the public-facing map side, of course, we want the public to become excited, aware of our historic resources, and we want to do that while also protecting those sites, those kinds of sites that could be damaged or destroyed by public engagement. And those include our archaeological sites, other pre-contact sites, and where we would worry that trespassing could be a big problem for those sites. The fun part of the database is that we are going to make it something that the public contributes to in a way that democratizes it, that moves it beyond a very controlled top-down sense of what important historic sites there are in Anchorage. The public would be able to correct us, submit their stories, submit their sites recommended for being added to our register. This is a beta map, and once we have the maps fully developed, it will be able to allow the user to visualize different aspects of the data. And these maps here happen to highlight which sites that we have so far in the database are either eligible or listed in the register, or that are have been deemed ineligible or are pending. And the map on the far right shows the entire municipality. We're still developing it, but it actually already has proven helpful for us. About a month ago, we applied for a $5,000 grant to the NPS Paul Brune Historic Revitalization Program grant, and we weren't eligible because it's a rural grant and we're Anchorage. But what we were able to do with this map is to show that we've done our homework. We do have parts of the municipality of Anchorage that are quite rural. And so we demonstrated where those were and that we had identified sites that are eligible on the register, because this grant would allow us, it's a sub-grant program, and it would allow the municipality to issue 5 to 7 grants of $50,000 to $75,000 each for rehabilitation, preservation of historic and cultural sites in rural communities like the native village of Eklutna up north, all the way south to towns or communities like Indian and Girdwood on the Turnagain Arm. And we barely caught sight of this grant as it was open for only 30 days. We found out that no one else, it seemed, in Alaska was applying for it. It's highly competitive. So we decided to apply for it, had a week and a half to do it. And it happened to be the night of our August commission meeting that the grant application was due. So we had to have the commission to vote on a resolution to support it about 2 hours before the grant deadline. I was late for the meeting because the other staff person on this, Michelle Nelson, talked me into driving north to Eklutna to take pictures to prove that Eklutna is a rural community while she drove south towards Girdwood. So we turned the application in about an hour before its 8 p.m. deadline on August 21st. And we're waiting hopefully with hope towards announcement of an award. Before I turn it over to Deirdre, this grant that we're using to develop this database is a $6,000 grant with a 40% match, which we're meeting through staff time and Deirdre's time as a professional historian who's familiar with the Alaska Heritage Resources Survey, which is the state's database, because unlike Paul, who presented just a moment ago, we don't have to go to the 8-track tapes or whatnot. We can build from the state's database, the AHRS. How many of you use the AHRS or familiar with it? Yeah, so it's a wonderful base for this. The municipality did go through a big process to do kind of what Paul's talking about, and it developed in 2012. Its own database, which has about 3,000 sites near downtown, and we're combining those together. And we are consulting with the stakeholders. I won't go into how we broke out $10,000, but we managed that. The state of Alaska, our grantor, also required us to develop a flow chart of how we were developing this database from our data sources. So that's the kind of flow chart you get for $6,000, and it makes it look really simple. But I'm going to turn it over to Deirdre, and Deirdre's going to talk about how it isn't so simple, even existing database, to consolidate them, to make them work together and to make sure the data we show is appropriate. So turn it over to Deirdre.
So I'm a relative newcomer to the commission. So I have been working with Michelle primarily, who is kind of an expert in GIS. And she did most of the work, and I would just kind of consult in meetings. So forgive my perhaps ignorance of certain things, but I also wrote down notes so that I would try to cover what needed to be covered without going on too long with unnecessary information. So as Tom said, I'm left-handed, so right-clicking isn't my, is it left? Okay, it's left. There, suited for me. So as Tom mentioned, we're creating a new database. And by doing this, we are looking at the AHRS and also this survey, this 2012 survey that was done and has thousands of sites listed in an Excel spreadsheet. So we're coming from a very complex database that the state has, and then also an Excel site, which we are then creating in an ESRI GIS type of database. So Michelle and I realized that we needed to kind of figure out the types of information that that we need to apply for our local landmark database. And obviously the AHRS is used at a very high level for experts in the field. Cultural resource managers, historic preservation experts, all of this. So it has an awful lot of information, and we realize we don't need that level of information in our database. And if we do need to access that information at some point, we can go to the AHRS generally and find that information. So what we did was look at what keywords, what key descriptors they are using. It's not the exact field name, but essentially what is contained in the AHRS that we would like to retain in our database. And so this is the list of the kind of key words, key descriptors that we chose. And these give you an idea of the information that we're going to be taking from the AHRS. And our goal with this also is to have a database that is not incredibly cumbersome. Again, we are going to have a public-facing side, and we have our private internal database, but regardless of whether it's public or private, we can't afford, we're not on the scale of the state to be able to maintain and update a very complex database. So we are trying to keep it within a certain level of information. Now, this did prove to be a little bit more complicated than we first anticipated. But what we're doing is essentially we're keeping the HRS number as our first kind of field, because that will tie it then to that database. And that is a very important point of information for us. Now, not all of our entries will be even on the AHRS database, but the majority of them will be. We are also putting kind of the site name, the significance. Now, the significance, as it appears in the AHRS, it has a lot of information. So some of these things we have to draw out some other keywords and details. We're very reliant on the determination of eligibility. What has the state determined as far as eligibility for their register? And then also they have a note of if it may be eligible for the national register. So we have elements, fields that we're going to create with that. The location, the description, the historic period or function, we have certain terms that we've decided on those. The culture code, the architect or builder, and then the destruction status. So these are all kind of key areas of interest for us. And so that's our AHRS, but we're also taking in this MOA survey, which enables us, this has information and sites that aren't necessarily included in the HRS. They might be more localized in importance, or they might have been kind of just come into eligibility. And again, this is in an Excel spreadsheet. So it has different terms that they're using and different breakdowns. And so we had to kind of try to reconcile their information, the AHRS information, and then decide what fields we want to have. This MOA survey, it also has a lot of documents attached, historic documents regarding some of these sites, which the AHRS has as well. But the this is something that we will, that is helpful for us, especially on some of the sites that don't appear in the AHRS, and we will be incorporating that into our database. We then have new fields. These are fields that Michelle and I, and in discussion with some of the stakeholders, decided that would be important for us to include on our database. So we're looking at, and this is actually also a requirement from our grantor. So we have historic inventory versus register. So that is something that we need to have. The designation type, if it's local, state, national register, the documents, and then probably the one that we've taken the most time and consideration with at this point is is it okay for public? And that's just a yes or a no. And basically what that means is that what do we want when we go into our phase 2 with the public facing map? What do we want to have available for public consumption and public viewing? And that ties in with what Tom was talking about with protecting sites and making sure that they aren't damaged or avoiding trespass on these sites, things like that. So we came up with some red flag terms. And if these terms appear in the description of a site, we kind of pulled some of the sites that we knew would be problematic, and we kind of downloaded the information from the AHRS. And we went through and we kind of tried to identify terms that might alert us to the fact that this site needs to be kept private unless the stakeholder concerned wants it to be made public. And essentially that relates a lot to the Indigenous sites, such as there's a few sites in Point Campbell. The native village of Akluna has quite a few sites. And we have one of the commissioners works in the Land and Environment Department for the native village of Akluna. So he is always giving us feedback and advice. And then we also consulted with Aaron Leggett, who is the president of the native village of Akluna. And so this has been done, Michelle and I initially looked at it, but we made sure that we tried to get terms that we could flag so that these sites with these terms could be kept private. So that was a very important part, and that is also something that's ongoing. So if anybody has any term or word, like we didn't have culturally modified trees before we talked to Aaron. So, there are certain terms that I'm not an anthropologist, and Michelle isn't either. So, we don't have all of the knowledge. I've used some of my historical knowledge, but that's minimal. So anything that you would like to add, please do. Quickly, I'll just show you, this is a little bit of the idea of, this was a field mapping exercise that we did, where we have some of the fields put in. This is kind of a mock-up of what our database would look like. And we've used 2 examples here. We've used the Oscar Anderson House, which is the bottom one, and then Birchwood Airport House Pits. House Pits is on our red flag list. So that, when we ran it, it would come up, and is it available for public access? No, it's not. Whereas the Oscar Anderson House is. So that's what will happen, hopefully. That is our intention. As I said, the data cleanup has been more kind of extensive and complex than we, that caused us actually to have to break this grant up into 2 phases. This part of the grant is phase 1. So we're still working on cleaning up our data. And again, any feedback, any information, any expertise that you guys might have. We are really open to hearing because it helps us to give the cleanest, the simplest type of information that we can. Okay, I'll really fast. Another aspect of this is how are we going to keep this database updated? We don't want it to become a stagnant site. And so we are going to revisit the AHRS database periodically, probably annually, and look at their one field of modified by and look to see whatever has been modified in that previous year, we will then upload that data onto our database and hopefully have the most up-to-date information and determinations of eligibility. So that's basically what we're doing right now. I'll give it back to Tom for a moment. Sorry. And it is time. Do you want to just finish it? Okay.
We'll approach us with any questions or suggestions you have about our database, and we'll be appreciative of that. So, and there's Lincoln, Nebraska's version. We're hoping to be like Lincoln. So,
Thank you. Sorry to rush you. I know we don't have our fourth presenter, and Paul had to leave, so we only have questions for the three of you, but I don't want us to go over time, so trying to stick to it. So our next presenter is Greta Helfenstein. I say it with a German accent. And her presentation is titled A Pivotal Pathway, Exploring the Bering Land Bridge and the Peopling of Alaska. And Greta is a recent graduate of Eastern Washington University with a Bachelor of Arts degree in history. And she's presented papers before at the Alaska Historical Society and other conferences. And she says she loves all things history. So Greta, thank you. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me all right? Excellent. Okay. So I've written a paper for you all today, and I hope you really enjoy. I'm going to start. The first pathway to Alaska now lies submerged beneath the icy waters of the Arctic and Northern Pacific Oceans. Providing a passage from present-day Siberia to Alaska, the Bering Land Bridge is the first connection to Alaska's earliest inhabitants. The land bridge theory is surrounded by heavy scholarly discussion. However, the bridge itself is undeniably an essential lifeline for human entry into Alaska and later the Americas. Though the history of the peopling of the Western Hemisphere remains muddled by the myriad of theories that surround it, emerging evidence is shedding light on a clearer picture of how the Americas were first populated. By examining this data, the important task of tracing the identity and origins of Indigenous people in the Americas can begin. The goal of my research has been to disentangle the many theories surrounding the peopling of the Americas, examine our current understandings, and explore as best we can the ancestors of Alaska's Indigenous people. Through an examination of the evidence, I found that two theories, the land bridge and Pacific coastal route, best explain the migration and settlement of the Americas. The land bridge is especially important when examining Alaska, but it often remains clouded by misconceptions that need to be corrected. To gain a better understanding of the land bridge, we have to first explore the history of the theory's origin. The land bridge theory arose from a need to merge an understanding of Indigenous people in the Americas with Old World European theology and worldviews. Spanish priest and historian José de Acosta is credited with being the first to propose the idea of a land bridge in 1590 in his Historia Natural y Moral de las Indias. He surmised that the Americas and Asia must have been connected at some point, with a bridge allowing a flow of people between them. The basis of Acosta's statements was speculative and fictitious, framed by the political and religious restrictions of his period. But despite these biases and limitations, his theory endured as accepted knowledge for many centuries afterwards, facing very little criticism or opposition. So you can see on this map, it's pretty incredible that his theory was accepted because the inaccuracies about the world were pretty numerous at the time. Here you can see that everything is literally connected, and New Spain is one continent along with Asia. Our understanding of the land bridge and world geography has improved greatly since then. By using geological and archaeological evidence, we can paint a much clearer picture of what a migrational landmass between hemispheres would have looked like. Understanding the geographical history of the land bridge is essential to breaking down the inaccuracies. The first to confront is the tendency to describe the land bridge as a pathway for a grand continental crossing from one side of the world to another. Calling the Bering Land Bridge a migrational bridge or passage often conjures the idea of a small section of land, whereas the so-called bridge actually encompasses an entire subcontinent known as Beringia. The land bridge is not a bridge at all. Around 20,000 years ago, Beringia would have measured 1,000 kilometers in length, roughly the same distance from Seattle to San Francisco. In total, the entire subcontinent Beringia encompasses 4 million square miles. To better illustrate this size, you can see on the left the map here, starting at the Lena River in Siberia and ending at the Mackenzie River in Alaska. This is the entire subcontinent of Beringia, and the orange on the right here is everything that's covered by water now. So today, much of the subcontinent Beringia is buried underneath the sea, as you can see here. What remains now is a shallow waterway separating Siberia from Alaska. Another misconception is that the climate of Beringia was a dry and inhospitable place. Actually, pollen, sediment, and fossil evidence prove that the landscape of Beringia was host to herb-dominated tundra, abundant enough to support megafauna like mammoths, steppe bison, saiga, woolly rhinoceros, and horses. Researcher David Madsen points out that it's been argued that back then there was an even greater diversity of herbaceous vegetation than is found in the modern landscape. Here we have some artists who imagine what this plant and animal life would have looked like. This evidence of plant and mammal life reveals that Beringia was habitable and capable of sustaining human life as well. Indeed, with this life-supporting environment, humans lived on the land bridge, settling, hunting, gathering plants, and moving around during the thousands of years it remained open. Here today is what Beringia looks like, or what's left of it, and it's still supporting both plant and animal life, like the caribou on the left here. Another hotly debated question of the land bridge theory is the dates at which humans crossed it. Authors and Indigenous scholar Paulette Steeves concedes that there's no overall consensus for when initial migrations occurred or the number of migrations among professionals discussing the peopling of the Western Hemisphere. While geologists disagree about many details, they do agree that various evidence of sediment cores, fossilized pollen, and bathymetric mapping of the seafloor show that Beringia was open for 2 long periods, sometime between 75 and 45,000 years ago, and then again from as long as 36 to 11,000 years ago. During these periods, Beringia was exposed as a viable migrational pathway from Siberia to Alaska. It's important to note that these dates are changing all the time with new studies and evidence. Here, you'll see the land bridge levels at those 2 different periods of time where it would have been open. And then on the right, you can also see the former outline of what that whole subcontinent would have been on our current map here. So another challenge when dating human migrations to the Americas is the misconception that 13,000 years ago is the earliest possible date for the first crossings. Although attitudes are improving, many still resist accepting earlier estimates. Steeves again provides evidence for several sites that are currently being investigated. They show evidence of human activity and occupation in the Americas long before 13,000 years ago. Steeves has created maps and an extensive digital archive, which includes a comprehensive list of these Pleistocene-era sites, roughly pre-11,000 years ago. So on these maps, you can see the sites that have been dated to 11,000 to 22,000, and then even before that to before 22,000 years ago. In addition to this, you can find site names, artifacts, other evidence, all on her website, the Indigenous Paleolithic Database of the Americas. These earlier dates are often contested for a variety of reasons, but the most notable to address is the dilemma over the ice-free corridor. The ice-free corridor refers to a gap between the Laurentide and Cordilleran glacial ice sheets, which enabled migration southward from Alaska into the rest of the Americas. While Beringia was an uncovered and livable landmass, in contrast, much of North America was covered in glacial ice. The problem lies in that the ice sheets covered all navigable land migration routes for human travel until at the earliest, some 13,500 years ago. This is in direct contradiction to the sites that have been dated earlier and lie further south. Two of the most notable of these sites to mention are at Monteverde, Chile, and White Sands, New Mexico. At Monteverde, evidence of human occupation, including footprints, hearths, and other organic materials, have been dated to 14,500 years ago. And at White Sands, researchers have tested several sets of fossilized human footprints that date to even earlier, around 21 to 23,000 years ago. One particular set of footprints indicates a mother carrying a child, with her set of footprints occasionally accompanied by small ones when she sets them down. The data collected from both of these sites and many others are painting a picture of human presence in the Americas long before that stagnant date of 13,000 years ago. As a result of this dating dilemma, though, another theory of migration is necessary to explain these sites that predate the navigable ice-free corridor. The Pacific Coastal Route theory posits that seagoing individuals used watercraft to migrate from Asia to Alaska and then down the Pacific coastline. After reaching the coast of present-day Washington, unblocked by the glacial ice, people could settle inland and spread throughout both North and South America. Humans had already developed the technology for seagoing watercraft long ago, evidenced by the earlier colonization of Australia, some 65,000 years ago. A route along the islands and coastline of Siberia to Beringia and then further down the Pacific coast explains the presence of humans in America at both an earlier date and in the absence of the ice-free corridor. A study by Aaliyah Lesnick of the University of Buffalo examined rocks on 4 islands in southeastern Alaska. Her evidence showed that 17,000 years ago, the coast was ice-free and brimming with plants and wildlife. This study is pretty promising proof that supports the coastal migration theory. It seems most likely, then, that a combination of land migration in Beringia and Pacific coastal routes explain the first human settlement of the Americas best. Much still remains to be investigated. As author Steves puts it, the picture of human dispersal across the Americas is far more complicated than previously believed. Given the size and ecological diversity, a much longer time frame is required for people to have had time to move across and adapt to new environments. While the land bridge theory does not serve as a definitive argument for how all the Americas were populated, it's still crucial to telling the story of the early populations of Alaska. Whether by land or sea route, if we recognize Beringia as the most likely first pathway to Alaska and how it came to be settled, the next big question is, by whom? It's virtually impossible to directly connect the first people who crossed Beringia with living relatives today. That said, evidence procured through the study of DNA at early sites is beginning to reconstruct a genetic history of Alaska. Mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, provides 5 isolated haplogroups that are distinct to indigenous people of the Americas. Haplogroups refer to ancestral groupings of people based upon a specific pattern of genetic variation in their mitochondrial DNA. Author David Madsen presents the evidence that ancient populations of the Arctic have nearly the same haplogroup frequencies as their modern antecedents, suggesting that many groups maintain their genetic integrity within a particular region over a considerable length of time, perhaps for thousands of years. So this DNA evidence of various haplogroups fill in a piece of the puzzle regarding migrational patterns and settlement. Multiple waves of migration are most likely, demonstrated by the genetic variation among the haplogroups. A more homogenized genetic set of data would be expected if there was only one large wave. So here you can see the potential dispersal of these haplogroups over time. Obviously, this map isn't totally accurate because it only shows inland routes and not coastal ones, but you can see a potential spread of these different groups over time. So the results of one study showed that haplogroups C and D were the first to expand from Siberia into the Western Hemisphere, beginning around 35 to 25,000 years ago. Haplogroups A and X expanded a little bit later, around 20 to 18,000 years ago. And then haplogroup B is the last group to enter, arriving 15 to 12,000 years ago. These dates fit the sequence of entry suggested by the different distribution throughout the Americas. This migrational pattern compares similarly to other regions of the world. 3 different sets of haplogroups were brought to Europe by colonizing populations at different times over the last 35,000 years. A similar pattern of population dispersal is emerging in Southeast Asia, Papua New Guinea, Australia, and India. Most regions of the world appear to have experienced multiple population expansions involving different sets of lineages. This similar pattern of haplogroup dispersal in the Americas can help explain genetic distinction and lineages among modern groups of indigenous people. Here we'll see in this map the dispersal of these different genetic and linguistic groups. So the genetic evidence is compiled by comparing the remains of both ancient and modern humans in Alaska. The findings reveal that people in the American Arctic and Siberia inherited many of their genes from a common group. Modern descendants of this ancient population include the Yupik, Inuit, Unangin, and Nadini language speakers from Alaska and northern Canada. This group of shared ancestors, often referred to as the Arctic small tool tradition people, lived in Alaska around 5,000 years ago. They are known for their easily portable microblade technology, found at sites all throughout Alaska, the Arctic, and even Greenland. Though the small tool tradition ancestors can be dated back about 5,000 years, there's still a large gap between them and the very first inhabitants of Alaska. Bridging the gap between living groups of Alaska Native people and their Beringia inhabiting or seafaring ancestors is the goal of further genetic research. As important as archaeological and genetic evidence are to understanding migration and settlement in the Americas, it's also important to recognize that many Indigenous people have oral histories of their origins and migrational history. A prominent example is that many Na-Dini tales of migration are from one land to another. In 1789, Alexander Mackenzie related that the Dini people told him, in ancient times their ancestors' feet were worn out with walking, that they had migrated, had traversed a great lake which was narrow, shallow, and full of islands, a land where it was always winter with ice and deep snow. Oral histories help to create a narrative of living Alaska Native people and their ancestors. Anthropologist Julie Cruikshank puts it quite eloquently. Oral tradition is like a prism, which becomes richer as our abilities improve to view it from a variety of angles. Working in coordination with the Indigenous inhabitants of the Americas, who've occupied these lands for thousands of years, creates a mutually beneficial relationship. In a recent study, researchers collaborated on the proper reburial of an ancient individual's remains after their genetic testing. The studies are a good example of genetic testing along with working with respect for Indigenous people. Combining empirical data with living memory and tradition create a more complex and detailed picture of migration and settlement across the Western Hemisphere. While the investigation into the origins and migrations of people in the Americas is fascinating, it's also important to recognize the modern groups Indigenous people are connected to today. As seen in this map, there are several diverse cultural regions in Alaska today with over 200 federally recognized tribes. The identities of modern individuals are a combination of their ancient ancestors and current cultural groups. Understanding one's identity involves combining past and present. As genetic research continues to reveal more about the ancestry and history of humans as a whole, our identities will evolve to reflect new elements of our pasts. The land bridge theory and the Pacific coastal theory will continue to be investigated to form a picture of habitation and migration in the Americas. Weaving Indigenous understandings of the past with scientific evidence will create a more complete historical narrative. Through this collaboration and open-minded research, we will continue to fill in the blanks to paint a more complete picture of human history. Perhaps it's summed up best by Steve, speaking from her mixed Indigenous and European heritage. Knowledge of the human past has always been and remains in a continual state of growth. We should not expect our understanding of early human populations in any area of the world to remain static. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Greta. To say our fourth presenter, Dave Norton, or David W. Norton, we have two David Nortons. He is not able to attend this afternoon. So, but he has said if anybody is interested in seeing the slides from his presentation, which his presentation is Beringia Combining History and Science, that we'd be happy to send you a PDF of those slides. You won't get his narration and to explain the slides, but we're happy to provide those. If anybody's interested, just come up to me after the session and we'll get those to you. We have actually 15 minutes. Tom and Deirdre, I don't know if you wanted to finish up your talk that I interrupted, if you had more to say to conclude it. Can you bring that up? Okay.
Can you repeat what they said so people on Zoom can hear? They don't have the mic.
repeat, so Deirdre and Tom, they're gonna put up the last slide from their presentation that has contact information. So if anybody wants to ask them questions, especially those of you online. Here in the room, do we have questions from anybody? We have plenty of time now.
Tom and Deirdre, nice to see you. I was surprised to see you on the panel. I'm very, very excited about this database. As a former user of the AHRS, it is unwieldy and it has too much information, particularly archaeological, for the public. I'm very interested in the red flag terms that you guys have got there. All of those seem smart for not having on a public database, but I wonder, it seems to me, looking at those terms, that we would be missing a big kind of Indigenous component to the municipality of Anchorage by removing many of those terms. So I wondered, how do you plan to put them on that cultural landmarks map for our lovely little city in a public-facing way? So anyway, very excited about the work that you're doing. Nice to see you there. Tom, we haven't met, but anyway. And someone else want the mic? No?
Hello? Is this working? Yep. Thank you, Pierce. Yeah, that is actually something I didn't quite mention, but really with those red flag terms, we're working very closely with stakeholders. And that is something that we're leaving up to them. We, of course, do want to have the public aware of these sites and learn from them. And so one of the things that could be a possibility, if they are willing to share it, is that we wouldn't put the exact data of its location. It would be kind of an approximate, in the village, the native village of Eklutna, there are 5 sites, and just kind of have a general, and I know with Point Campbell, same type of thing, that we wouldn't give that exact GPS location that is available to the other sites, but that will be left up to the stakeholder associated with the site. But that's a really great question. Thank you, Pierce, because I didn't really mention that. So, but of course, it is all about learning. It's about wanting to include all of this information for the public, but also with respecting their concerns that they have about just putting this information out into the public without any kind of safeguards in place.
Other questions?
Yeah, Greta, I'm sorry I missed part of your presentation, but I was just curious about the map where you show the Alutiiq people, Supiaq people, because the language I've always heard that the language of the Supiaq is much closer to the Yupik. So I was just curious how you drew those. You merged 2 different cultures to me, or 2 different peoples, I think, but that's just my knowledge. So.
Are you referring to the last map that was on the screen up there?
Yeah, that last map.
That was a large conglomeration of just different cultures, not necessarily by language group or identity. It's just several areas as federally defined in Alaska, but not, obviously there's much more diversity within those
I
groups.
was just saying, like the Yupik language, people in the villages south of Anchorage, they speak a form of Yupik. So it just, to me, that didn't reflect that. Thank
Greta, thank you for your presentation and your interest in Beringia. I was just curious, in all your scholarship and your interest in this topic, have you ever had access to or been able to study any other contributions from the other side of Beringia, from like Russian scientists and academics, or anybody else in those zones? I'm just curious if those were accessible, or if it is now or in the past. Thanks.
There were a lot of interesting comparisons from many scholars to basically of the genetic similarities between people in Siberia and those that would have crossed Beringia and who are now Native Alaskan. And I thought that it was really interesting how many connections were made there. But there was also an important thing to consider when I was researching is there was a tendency to always try and compare Indigenous people of Alaska to those who were from Asia and Siberia. It's actually a long tradition that they had before we knew so much genetically about DNA and the variety that was over here, how the haplogroups are distinct from those that are in Asia. But people would try to compare language groups and physical features of Indigenous people, and it was sort of a comparison that we wanted to stay away from when I was doing this research. Obviously, there are certain groups that are related to each other, but the tradition of trying to compare and not have unique identities here was something I stayed away from. But in regards to your other question about Russian scholars and people over in Asia, I didn't have access to many materials that were in English, but obviously their contributions are important and helpful too. And there's many sites in Siberia that are being investigated sort of in the same way for genetic evidence and for evidence of humans that early on.